Hey class, in this video lecture, we'll discuss softening your bad news. More specifically, we will look at some simple tips and techniques that you can use to soften the blow of your bad news statements in your bad news messages. Let's start with our first tip. Use positive language to frame your bad news. Now, to be clear, this tip goes above and beyond the clarity principle that we discussed previously, the importance of avoiding negative language, those negation words like not or un. Of course, we want to avoid that kind of negative language when conveying bad news. We want our bad news statements to be as clear as possible, and therefore, yes, we want to avoid negation words like not or un. But even more importantly, we want to frame our bad news in the sunniest, most optimistic fashion possible. We want to direct our audience's attention away from the hurtful elements of the bad news and emphasize the opportunities for good news that may remain in the future. So let's take a look at an example of a real bummer bad news statement and think about how we can use positive language to soften the blow of this statement. So here we have the statement, "You failed to include the necessary paperwork." Very negative, very accusatory. We can soften it by framing it positively. Please resubmit your claim once you have gathered the necessary paperwork. It's still clear that the individual's claim is being denied, but we're focusing on the positive. We're focusing on the fact that they can resubmit the claim once they've gathered the necessary paperwork. Next tip, you want to use passive voice strategically. As you may recall from our previous conversations around clarity, passive voice, while generally not preferable, does have some potentially useful features and benefits. It can help us obscure who is responsible for a particular action or outcome, and it can also help us avoid assigning blame. And as you might imagine, both of those features of passive voice can be extremely useful when conveying bad news. So let's take a look at another example of bad news and think about how we can use passive voice to soften the blow of this bad news. So in this statement, original statement, we're saying, "You did not format this document correctly, so I took 4 points off." This is a very direct, very accusatory kind of statement. It very clearly specifies who made the mistake and who is imposing the penalty. And sometimes that can be useful, but that is a very harsh way to convey the bad news. So if we want to soften it, we can use passive voice here. The document is formatted incorrectly. Formatted by whom? We don't know. So 4 points were deducted. Deducted by whom? We don't know. Notice how that feels significantly less harsh and accusatory because we're strategically obscuring who made the mistake and who is imposing the penalty. That's another great example of how you can soften your bad news. And then finally, you can soften your bad news by subordinating it, by pushing it into a subordinate clause within your sentence, which is another way of saying a subset or a portion of your sentence that cannot stand on its own as a complete sentence. For a variety of reasons that we don't need to discuss here, readers tend to pay less attention to subordinate clauses than dominant clauses being portions of a sentence that can stand alone. And so putting bad news into a subordinate clause is a good way to smuggle it past your reader while still stating it very clearly. So here's an example of a bad news statement that is not using any of these tips or techniques to soften the blow. "Your draft is unacceptable as written. I have given you some revision notes and will extend the deadline." We can soften this by subordinating the bad news, by pushing it into a subordinate clause, ideally at the beginning of the sentence. Although your current draft is unacceptable, you can review the attached revision notes and resubmit your work by 11:15. Notice how we've pushed the bad news, the fact that the current draft is unacceptable, into that subordinate clause, right? And it's a subordinate clause because the words, although your current draft is unacceptable, those words cannot stand alone as a complete sentence. We've pushed the bad news into that subordinate clause, and then we've used the dominant clause, the portion of the sentence that can stand alone, to emphasize the positives. All right, so we've smuggled that bad news past our reader by pushing it into a subordinate clause, and we've used the dominant clause to focus on the positives. So remember, these are techniques that you can use to soften the blow of your bad news statement when you're writing bad news messages. And remember, you only want to drop your bad news once, whether you're writing a direct or indirect bad news message. We've got a strict one and done policy in this class. So state your bad news once and strongly consider using one or more of these techniques to soften your bad news. Thanks for watching, everybody.